It's a real pleasure to welcome you, Christian, apart from a great speaker, a good friend. So for 30 minutes about, we'll listen to Christian, and then there will be a bit of time for Q&A afterwards. So Christian, please.
Thank you, and good to be here on such a beautiful, beautiful morning in Göteborg. This sound will probably come on when I finally want sound. Got two jobs to do at the same time. Maybe I'll help by running this one here. This one will get in. If we do, we'll steal it here. See if that works. So, okay, what I'll share with you this morning is in some ways going to be part of my journey into the same kinds of conversations that you just had this morning on futures. Because when I started working at Reglab more than 10 years ago, we were really concerned with something else, which was very much the now, and how government could become more responsive to citizens' needs and become systematic in the ways in which we engaged and empathized with people, with citizens. But over time I've realized that we also need to take the longer perspective. And so it's kind of timely, and that's also why I'm so happy with the invitation, that in my current job we are actually working quite systematically with the future, and we're working with 2050. So that's kind of an interesting coincidence, or maybe it's not a coincidence, because some of the people we at least speak to, for example at Oxford Business School, where they have a very strong scenarios program, they say that if you really want to work on opening up new conversations about the future, and maybe going beyond what we already know or think we can expect, that 2050 is actually quite a relevant timeline. So that's one of the things that we certainly took with us when we started. So my current job is to run the Danish Design Center. Now this building does exist, it's no longer just an architectural rendering, but this building is not just the one we are in, it's not just my building, it's also the building where the Danish Architecture Center is located, and where a new innovation hub in Copenhagen is located called Blocks. And the hub is called Blocks Hub, and actually that's where Magnus and I met last time, because now this is becoming a bit of a magnet for international visitors and of course also locals in discussing what is actually the theme for the building and the whole project is our urban future. Or more precisely, and that's something that we've worked very hard from the Danish Design Center to get in, it's about co-creating our urban future. And so, of course, urbanization is not the only thing, and many of you from some of the Swedish regions will know that, of course, and I saw actually in one of your earlier conferences looked into what's the future of rural areas, or how can innovation happen, and what smart cities in rural areas. Something we also look at the Danish Design Center, but we do look at the implications of urbanization for the future at a global level. So that's Blocks right there. Then the Danish Design Center, we are not an exhibition, and we are also not so concerned with Danish design furniture, even though we actually do work on that area as well. Actually, we just yesterday had a competition for the climate summit, COP24 in Poland, about creating sustainable Nordic chairs. So we do work with the chairs sometimes, but what we mostly do is we work on a very sort of ambitious mission to empower businesses, people, and public organizations to shape the next. And shaping the next is, of course, a future-oriented activity, and then you can ask, well, the next what? And we would say, well, that depends on what you need to shape. What do you need to design? Services, products, often it's business models. When it comes to government, it is governance models, new ways of running our public organizations. An example at sort of a big scale is we're working with the United Nations Development Program on how would they shape the next organizational model globally. So 160 countries, it's an organization under a massive pressure, both externally and internally. How could they take a more platform-oriented, platform-based, as they call it, approach to governing and to connecting with the societies in which they work and the stakeholders with which they work, And so that's sort of a major transformation program there going through. And we are suggesting that design methodologies can be a powerful way to begin to shape that new governance model and also engage the organization across the world in it. Could also say that we're working on connecting designers with decision makers, and you can take a guess who is the designer in this picture and who is the decision maker, but your guess would probably be correct because it is the designer to the left. But I'm showing this picture sometimes because I think we have some very, very different cultures in our society when it comes to organizations, when it comes to change, and that part of our role as a publicly funded organization, we're funded and we're part of the Ministry of Business in Denmark, is how do we bridge the, you could call it the creative industries, the innovators, the outliers, the wildcards on the one side, with the huge institutional embedded structures we have, both in government and also in business, that need to shape something different. And bridging that gap can sometimes be quite hard. In this image, you see them having their backs turned to each other, and actually often they don't speak the same language, don't really communicate, and we need to begin to find better ways of, you could say, cross or even transdisciplinary collaboration. We believe that designers actually have some of the tools and skills that can help, but they also probably, the designers, at least in Denmark, also need perhaps some contributions in terms of how can they become more relevant and make themselves more relevant in business and government. So as Magnus said, for a long time I've looked into these issues of designing for policy, designing for change, both in government and in the private sector. And actually in my most recent publication, I'll show it to you by the end. It's a bit of a cliffhanger, but by the end I'll just show that the last book I came out with is actually opening up with a scenarios case study. And that case study is what I'll share with you this morning. So it's true, I ran MindLab for 8 years. I was actually not the founder. I came in 2007 until 2014. But MindLab was one of the first, if not the first, policy or a public service lab inside a government. Certainly one of the first to be cross-governmental, which meant that we worked across multiple silos of the public sector, across central government, and also actually worked with a large city and municipality. So we had both state and local level included in our governance and in terms of what we worked on across employment policy, business policy, education, schools, and actually beginning to do some of the first labs in Denmark, or experiments in Denmark on the future of public governance from a very practical point of view. So doing very hands-on experimentation across different levels of government, including the regional level. So you can't really read this, and that's of course a bit of a problem since some of my slides have that background color, which is supposed to be pink, but it looks like more like white. But I'll just I'll speak, and then we can see. I think, you know, as you probably talked about yesterday, things are changing: technology, cultures, markets, and so on. And that's the backdrop, that we see a lot of different dimensions of our society is changing. I heard someone say this morning that the future is coming faster than ever, or perhaps at least the feeling we need to address the future is maybe more urgent than ever. At least it feels that way. Complex networked, I think, is something we can always agree on, that things are connected, not least because of digitization, of course. But I think actually the last word I have up here, which is turbulent, is maybe both the most worrying part right now. Some of you mentioned this morning the political situations across many countries, including, I was actually walking over here this morning, I thought, who's the Prime Minister of Sweden? Do you have one yet, or? No, okay, just wondering. And I'm wondering, do you know when you get one? No. Well, so turbulence, I guess, is not only in the US or to the east of us or to the south or in Asia, but we have some turbulence going on here as well, and that may be symptomatic of how we're getting, out of tune with ways in which we could address the future or address this complex world we're in. So new business models and new governance models, and actually it's interesting. Where I work now, maybe as compared to MindLab, we actually are engaging almost equally, mostly with business, but quite a lot also with government. And we're seeing some of the same questions of a systemic nature. What's the future of value creation in this market or industry, in this business? Or what is the future of governing across this field, which is changing rapidly? And the kinds of questions that leaders and managers are asking themselves look quite similar. And the leadership issues as well feel and look quite similar across public and private. And so in the afternoon, or just a bit later today, I'll share with you some of the insights we've gained around leadership and navigating this kind of complexity and change, where interestingly enough, you can find quite similar case examples across government and business. That doesn't mean there aren't also some quite big differences between policy making in the public sector and strategizing in the private. But to some extent, the challenge is to begin to bring these things much, much more together. That's actually also what I would like to share with you this morning. So my journey has been to play around with scenarios and foresight as a management consultant back a long time ago, then at Reglab, then in different academic situations, also with Oxford, and now at the Danish Design Center. And my experience, also I worked with the Canadian government. They have had a whole team, 20 people, I think they still do, called Horizons Canada, which is one of the biggest teams in central governments anywhere working on foresight. Singapore has something as well, other countries too, but Canada was really huge. Problem was, you couldn't really sense whether anything came out of the long reports, big analysis, conferences and so on they were running. And they had these beautiful publications, 50, 100, 200 page publications about the future. And when you ask the leaders in these foresight teams, well, who's using it and what are they changing? They couldn't say. And there's so much time, so much effort, so much intellectual energy going into good foresight work that I couldn't help think to myself, what a waste. And begin to wonder how could one maybe do it differently. And we began to do some workshops and conversations also with other countries on combining foresight with maybe something else. Because I truly do think that we must leverage the creativity and intellect and the power across all sectors of our society to create, or explore at least, what could be desirable futures. Absolutely. And some of these scenario processes actually did that in some ways because they did address different sectors and domains. But I do think that we must at the same time really, really do it in ways, in concrete ways that create better chances for change to happen. Because otherwise it is just paperwork, it's busy work, it's innovation theater, and it's, it's interesting from an academic or analytical point of view, but it's not interesting from a policy point of view. And I remember speaking even to someone at a very high level in government who was establishing these kinds of teams and who just expressed huge disappointment in all the efforts that they didn't really lead to any tangible change. So the question becomes how? And I think in some ways, the ways we've been addressing futures is like as if we're addressing natural sciences. It's as if we are just unpacking a lot of issues and themes and uncertainties and so on, trends, but we're not really enabling ourselves to actively shape the future. And so I really like this quote from the Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon, even though I also disagree with Herbert Simon in some ways, and some of his work. I'll get back to that in the afternoon, actually with a criticism of Herbert. But on this one, I think there's a huge distinction we need to make between trying to understand the world and trying to shape the world. And most of us in this room as well, my bet is that we were all educated to learn to understand the world and analyze the world, unpack the world, but not necessarily to actively shape it. Of course, that's also why I hope many of you were here this morning and yesterday, because that's actually what is needed. But we didn't learn how to do it. My own background is political science, then I studied leadership and design, but ultimately my academic background in political science did not teach me very much, if anything, about how to shape change. Even though many of my fellow students went into policymaking, became ministers and senior leaders in government, but we didn't really learn how to run those processes that are engaging people, organizations, institutions in meaningful change. It's actually surprising we are able to do policy even so. Probably it's because some politicians come around and say, I just want this to happen, and then we somehow figure it out. So what we did last year at the Danish Design Center was to say, let's take a look at how could we actually experiment with and try out foresight and scenarios in a bit of a different way. So we picked a nice area which we thought could be ripe for change and where we might be able to make a contribution, namely healthcare. So we titled the project Boxing Future Health, and the reason is that we originally thought we'd create future scenarios in physical installations inside shipping containers. In Denmark we have a small company called AP Møller Mærsk. They have quite a few containers for shipping, and they actually were ready to loan us some or give us some for the project. We thought that's a great idea. But I can then I'll show you later, it turned out to actually we did not build it into containers, so there's nothing boxy about this project at all, but now the title stuck, so it's still Boxing Future Health. At least you could say we're trying to box in or to create some frames around possible futures in this project. Let's see. So these are some of the technologies that are changing. And if you wanted to do a futures project on healthcare, you would say, well, actually you have to begin to look into all the implications of all of this stuff. For how we run hospitals, for primary care, for governance, policy, regulation, for new business models and so forth. And that's also going on, and in some projects we also work with that. But 2050, I'm sure as you know, I mean, much of this, we don't even know whether these technologies are relevant, or what we call them by then. What's been winning, what's been losing in terms of the tech game, and what are the applications. So actually maybe we have to look at what might society be like, rather than what would technology be like. So this was the starting purpose, and this was what we wanted to do. And we wanted to do it by engaging a lot of people in the process. So this became a bit of some placeholders for something that we thought could be interesting. Define the future use of healthcare, that may be a big thing, but maybe explore what could the future or who could the future use of healthcare be. So in many ways, these are just placeholders for the project in terms of exploration. And then we said, why don't we spend as much energy on going from the future and back as we do on creating the possible futures. So absolutely using foresight scenarios, methodologies to get to possible futures, actually not just one, but four. But then really spend some energy and time on coming back to the present and engaging people of the present, institutions of the present, in discussing the implications. So the way I look at it is that the first process here has taken us about 1 year to come from 2018 to 2050, but the process of going back from 2050 and discussing the implications will probably be a 5-year program or process, and we've just started on within the recent months. Design thinking, design doing. You could say that the thinking, as I just mentioned, we're pretty good at that, but the doing, we're maybe not so good at that. Even in design, there's a lot of focusing on design thinking, as in a way you could say, how do we learn from the mindsets of designers in how we do management? But we also do need, I believe very strongly, the craftsmanship and the ability to give form and physical and graphical and visual expression to things that designers can do. So we wanted to combine design thinking and doing, and we wanted to leverage design in the ways that we know how, which is these three interpretations of what design is about. Designing for us is exploring possible futures. It is exploring them from a human perspective, using ethnography, anthropology, and other disciplines there, but also just challenging your assumptions about futures. It's co-creation and co-designing new ideas. And finally, it's turning those ideas and abstract concepts into something so tangible and concrete. We can rehearse it, we can try it out, we can test, we can experiment, and that's really where I believe design and design activity is the most powerful. Is in that practical area. But often when we do foresight, we kind of stop somewhere around here. We may have some exploration, certainly of the analysis. We also have maybe some ideas or recommendations, but we never get to really try it out. We never get to put on those scenarios and experience them in any tangible way. Across industry, across government, across hospitals and so forth, academia as well. And we partnered up with both foresight people and with some very practical people who can actually build stuff in practice, and we can sort of just facilitate part of that. And then we got all of these different organizations across government, business, everything from startups to big institutions, in part of a one-year collaborative effort to design the scenarios. So lots of different sessions and collaborations. Kind of looks like this space we got here today, right? All the kind of work you've been doing. So very, very practical, hands-on. Then we began to prototype. This is the first, this is just a meeting room in our building, our previous building, just getting people trying out some spaces. We're going to use smell in these spaces, so how can we create scenarios? This was a future scenario, and we tested out different methodologies and tools for getting feedback and reflections. And then we said, well, how can we actually build a bit of a future lab? So now we went into sort of the boxing phase, which turned out, as you'll see, not really to be so boxy, but to be a bit more round. So instead of shipping containers, this is what we got to, and created these cylindric immersive spaces you could go and experience. And in the spaces you could also listen to the voice of patients from the future as a stimulation for your process. So of course lots of process, lots of tools, but also these narratives where we simply curated actors to be the patients of the future in the different scenarios and tell the stories of how they experience living in that future society. And actually, I'll give you the link later, but you can basically go online and listen to 4 sets of each, I think 3 narratives from patients from the future. And it's open source, you can go on our site and listen to it. It's both in Danish and in English as well. And then really working on what are the ways in which we can stimulate reflection and bring the experience, the positions, the strategies, the organizational situation of different actors into place that they can reflect on individually and together with their colleagues. What does this mean to us? So lots of work on tools, of course. So you could say that we created 4 plausible, not necessarily likely, but plausible, it could happen, types of scenarios that were all designed with all the whistles and bells of typical foresight work, but very much embedded in a human perspective. So here they are, and I'll just go through them briefly because what we're learning is that maybe these 4 scenarios could be useful not only for health or future of healthcare, but actually more generally. So we're going to do some work on that next year. Right now we've already been using the scenario methodology and some of the key trends and drivers and uncertainties in these scenarios for the development of future business policy with the national government, with the Ministry of Business, in some collaborative workshops. So we're already beginning to deploy these in quite different settings where it's a much broader agenda and much broader field than healthcare. Most for the most, so very briefly, just to get a sense of it, a scenario where this is taking the Swedish or the Danish or the British universal healthcare system and more or less extending it into a future with radically fewer resources per person, with the public sector under pressure, with recognition that we cannot treat everybody, we can treat most people reasonably well. And as a nurse said, who was part of our scenario workshops, this is the most scary scenario of all. It's a future where we actually don't change and we just continue. And the bodily experience, we created a space where we basically just go round and round and round in like a hamster wheel and listen to the patients who are living in that future. And as this nurse said, you know, that's just really, really depressing. Ministry of Root Causes, that's an interesting scenario. It's all about, you can read it, but it's all about with big data and any kind of insight and tracking in the future of people's behaviors, needs, actions, we will be able to prevent almost anything bad from happening, both in terms of physical injury, medical injury. So this is like the ultimate ultimate prevention scenario. And here we created a space where you basically fluff yourself down in pillows and in an environment where you're entirely surrounded and taken care of by the mommy state, and the state knows everything about you before you do, and nothing bad will ever be able to happen. The Health Bazaar, this is one of the most scary scenarios from a business perspective, because this is where anything goes. Values are fluctuating. People pick and choose alternative religions or meanings around what health means. It's an open plethora of opportunities where health is what you think it should be for you as an individual or family or community, and where there's a competition without any winner about defining how society should look at health. Which means that it's very hard to navigate. It might be very meaningful for individuals, but be very, very hard to navigate for policymakers or for businesses. And finally, the healthy eye. This scenario is the high-tech scenario, you could say, the one where we privatize, by the way. We have huge differentiation across society in terms of rich and poor, access to healthcare, but where you can actually replace your body and your body parts, and you can amend your intelligence and all those things we're reading about in an extreme scenario there. Now, I have a sound clip on this one, and I'm wondering if it can play or not, so we'll see if the sound plays, if I hit this. If not, we're fine, but it might be actually that it plays. Let's see. So there should be some sound playing now if you get it up. It's very hard with Macs, they always screw people up, so we'll try this one. So it should be playing, okay. So what I'll share with you, if it runs, is simply one voice, just a little introduction, then one voice for about a minute of what does it sound like when a patient from the future talks about life there. If it does work now, we can maybe work on it technically for after the. I have a session later today, and we can run it there if it doesn't really work. No. Okay. Yes, it's turned up. Yeah.
Keep striving higher. Take charge. Seize the possibilities. Experience your body's full potential. So, be part of a new era. Demonstrate what you can accomplish. Build your own future. Give your children access to all the same possibilities that we enjoy.
I'm not well. Diabetes, COPD, arthritis. Oh, it's a mess. Fortunately, I'm on the elite level with Secogard before I got sick. Oh, that was through work. They have full access to all my data, day or night. Even when I brush my teeth. Personal coaching and boost optimization for real. It's supposed to be making my body stronger. I also get mind boosts. My wife says I've become more attentive on every level. Maybe we'll take a cruise this summer. If there's anything left after I have paid Secogard. There's a reason why they call it chronic. But I feel I can handle it. They're doing everything they can for me. They even have caring homes. Imagine if I'd been basic public. Oh boy.
Yeah, if I'd been basic public, I would be in trouble. So we won't do this now, but you could ask yourself, what would you dream about for the future? And of course, this is just an illustration and maybe quite a simple way of talking about what things might be like. But these narratives that are very different from each scenario help people connect with the human implications of them. So just to round off, I'll say, what are some of the lessons that we learned from experimenting with this approach and now beginning to work with it with hundreds and hundreds of people across business, policymakers, nursing. We work with professional schools of nursing on the future of skills and competencies. What are the implications here? Could we use the scenarios for teaching and for training nurses? And people do love engaging into some kind of experience. It's fun, it's stimulating, it's interesting. So of course, it's not that difficult to get some kind of positive feedback on that one. But what we also see is that if these experiences can actually be combined with some more robust tools and processes that really leverage people's experience from their professional lives, from their day-to-day lives, from the strategies and organizational politics and ideas they have, then we can begin to do something that becomes more transformative. So in a way you could say that the scenarios become just a trigger of some much longer and more fundamental processes, but the scenarios become a frame of reference you can return to again and again, and you can also have those voices of people as part of that reference. So say the recipe that I think we can work more on, and that we at least so far are kind of extracting from this work, is creating a shared context. When we can do that by putting people into these different types of futures, and also creating an emotional or human connection with them. Enabling this immersion, and then really beginning to leverage co-creation, where I think the most powerful part really is when we do this across sectors, across domains, right? Startups together with policymakers, somebody in an entrenched business looking for the next business model, together with people in civic society representing users or citizens themselves. And so here are, I think, 3 placeholders for the kind of strategic approach I think we might need for working with scenarios. And now, I mentioned the book, this just came out, and in the future, the Boxing Future Health scenario is the one I actually opened the book with and describe how can this type of approach be one way of catalyzing innovation in government, in the public sector. And then finally, I promised also to give you the link. Here it is. This is the English version. I believe the Danish version is just without the /en. But here you can actually go online and you can hear the old gentleman you heard, but also all the other friends we now have, all the other citizens and patients from the future, if you wanted to try that out. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Christian. And we will have a bit of Q&A now, and as always, English, Danish, Swedish, even Swinglish is okay. We'll help out with words and translation. But let me just kick off with, if you could just comment on the, maybe not conflict, but the hardcore difference between like new public management, here and now, what is right, what is wrong, and 2050, about this explorative journey almost, and could you just comment on that?
Yeah, so, I think one thing is that I've been looking a lot into the future of public governance, and at the Danish Design Center, in a way, we see ourselves as, being part of government. We ourselves are experimenting with trying out, also in our own organization, what could a different way of governing look like, at the same time as we are also embedded into the key performance indicators and the outcome measurements and all the contracts and all the other nice stuff that we have when we are in contract with the state. I think what's 2 levels. So one is that going beyond the governance paradigms we know, so we have the new public management with us as contracting out, outsourcing, more market-based approaches. We have a lot of focus on evaluation and evidence and metrics, and we are then building on top of something else, which is classical bureaucracy and the classical administration, which is certainly with us still. So we have the classical organization of government plus the more market-based ideology of new public management, with some of the stronger parts of it, but also the challenges. And then we have something else, a third thing happening, right? We can call it network governance, or I've called it in one of my books, human-centered governance. But I think the big shift we're seeing now is that if we're going to govern effectively and with impact and to achieve change in society, we can no longer rely on models of governance, whether that's bureaucratic governance or it's new public management, that are as neatly described or prescribed as the old ones were. Which means that to step into the next model of governing is much more of a journey, it's much more of a discovery process, it's actually much more driven by the kinds of work we're doing here, but that's also quite an uncomfortable place to be as leaders and managers who kind of like some degree of safety or security or predictability, because this is all about the opposite. If we run a scenario process like this one, with 4 vastly different plausible scenarios, where might we end up? And so I think we're being challenged now, but if we want to move beyond the current governance models, we will have to live with, also organizationally, less predictability. And that means we have to lead in a very different way.
Questions? Har en har mikrofon.
Thank you for a very interesting seminar. My name is Anton Cesar. I'm from Region Västra Götaland, which is one of Sweden's biggest health organizations as well. So I thought this last example was very interesting to look at. And I get a feeling that the mindset here is quite Western oriented, perhaps even Eurocentric. And I've been reading in the newspapers these last weeks about Chinese experiments where they, for example, genetically modify to female mice and make babies. So, making a future without us men even necessary.
Yeah.
And how is that changing? Because the way I look at it is that perhaps the Chinese and the Eastern mindset has a bit less ethical boundaries.
Yes.
On their way of looking at experimentation and research.
Yeah.
And can you say a few words about how you see those two futures of health, futures of the Western and the Eastern?
So I'm not an expert on Asia and the East, but we do have a lot of conversation with people in Asia and visitors, and I think you're very right. I think that, there's a very nice book, I don't know how many of you know it, it's called Homo Deus by Harari, the author who also wrote Sapiens. And in that book, I'm reading it right now, it's on the future, right? And the next maybe even 100 years. And at one point, towards the end of the book, he says, actually, with the technology we will have, and the institutions we have, and the systems we have, we won't really need people that much. And we certainly don't need to take individual care of people the way we do in liberal democracies. And he's very much arguing that this, the things that are changing now begin to demonstrate the ending of liberal democracy. And so, and already now what we know from what's being done with facial recognition and use of data to surveillance citizens in China, all citizens, is coming to a point where you can begin to ask yourself, what's freedom? And so I think if we go beyond the West and liberal democracies, and you can argue what's going on with a liberal democracy right now, like the US, then there might be some very, very different ideologies dominating how we create our institutions and what they do. Now, I think personally, and this is actually something we may have a bit of an alliance around, that the Nordics specifically, but also Europe, has a very, very, very critical, important role to play the next 5, 10, 15 years, which is to actually take back liberal democracy and take back the human and take back some of the foundations of the welfare state that I think are under massive pressure, not just in Asia, but also very close to us. And maybe this kind of work can help us create more robust arguments for why don't we want to end up in some of these futures. And I love your question. This is not a very good answer, but we have some very important work to do if we don't want to end up somewhere where humans actually don't really matter.
Should we try for one more at least?
Apologize for the long answers.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I was wondering, with these co-creative models and way of creating experiments and policies, is it reasonable to think that the persons who are participating in these projects are very important for shaping the final outcome and such? It's a co-creation process. How do you work to decide who should we invite, which kind of perspectives must we have, and which can we be without, and how do we reach different kind of groups? Because that's always a challenge in these kinds of processes, I think.
So I think you have some good, another really good question. So one is, of course, to what extent do the participant determine the outcome, and to quite a high extent they do. So that of course creates bias, which means we have to be transparent about who we invite and why. I think also there are some balancing issues here, because of course in foresight work there's also a lot of looking into history, so the long lines of history and trends there. So we looked several hundred years back, actually 1,000 years back, on development of ideas about health when we did this project. So actually we did a whole session looking back. If you just show, there was a picture we did at the Medicine Museum, Medicinsk Museum in Copenhagen, to do the long view. And then also looking, of course, at technology pathways, at trends and so on that are more statistical or that are more quantitative, right? So there's some balancing. But then I think that diversity for us has been absolutely critical. We have worked in the process not just with the business leaders and policymakers, the startups and so on, but also with a philosopher, a priest, who are part of the collaboration groups, people from the finance and insurance sector, because money has got a lot to do with healthcare. In the future it will have even more to do with healthcare, also financing models. And so I think for us it was very important to have huge diversity, and also over time we ran 5 different major workshop sessions to create the scenarios. We had about 120 people go through. And so over time you get some more robustness because you get that diversity in, and every time you refine it. So I think, but that still means that yes, there is bias because of who's involved, and you have to have a strategy for making conscious decisions about it. So yeah.
Okay, once again, thank you very much, Christian. And